All right, class. So let's quickly review the anatomy before we can move on. So the human heart has four chambers. The upper two chambers are called atria. The lower two chambers are ventricles. We have a right atrium and a left atrium, and we also see a right ventricle and the left ventricle. In between the two atria, we have the interatrial septum, and the depression on the interatrial septum is called fossa ovalis. The general muscles of the atria are called pectinate muscles. Looking into the ventricles, the general muscles of the ventricles are called trabecular carne. The ventricles are separated from each other by interventricular septum. At the inferior portion of the ventricle, we have some finger-like muscles. Those are called papillary muscles. The ventricles are connected to the atria by AV valves or atrioventricular valves. Between the right atrium and the right ventricle, we have tricuspid valve, also known as right AV valve or right atrioventricular valve. In between the left atrium and the left ventricle, we have the bicuspid valve, also known as mitral valve, also known as left atrioventricular valve or left AV valve. How do we remember this? We try before we buy. Connecting the bi and the tricuspid valves to the papillary muscles are cord-like structures or thread-like structures called chordae tendineae. They hold the bi and tricuspid valves in place and prevent the valves from prolapsing as the pressure increases in the atrium. All right. One more thing I would like to add here. If you look into the ventricles, there are two valves. I cannot draw again. So there are two valves. We have one here and the other one here. And why is it not letting me draw sometimes? I don't know. So this valve right here is called the pulmonary semilunar valve. This is pulmonary semilunar valve. And this valve right here is the aortic semilunar valve. So we have pulmonary semilunar valve and aortic semilunar valve. I would like to add here that so annoying if I cannot draw. I would like to add here that the pulmonary semilunar valve leads to the pulmonary semilunar valve leads to this vessel called pulmonary trunk. That's the pulmonary trunk. And the aortic semilunar valve leads to the aorta, not shown here. Okay, so moving on. Now this is a complicated diagram as you see, but we will go slow and cover one thing at a time. All right? Okay. So let's start by labeling. We do see the heart and the lungs, right? And we see a bunch of blood vessels. Okay. We will start by labeling the four chambers of the heart. So this is the right atrium, left atrium, right ventricle, and left ventricle. Okay. And we are talking about blood flow through the heart. We are looking at blood flow through the heart. Okay. So deoxygenated blood or blood low in oxygen content is drained into the right atrium by two main vessels. And these vessels are called superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. These are the two vessels that carry deoxygenated blood from the different parts of the body into the right atrium. All right. There is another vessel that we will learn, and that is called the coronary sinus. I'll also draw it here. It's called the coronary sinus. This one also drains deoxygenated blood, but it drains the heart only. So deoxygenated blood from the heart wall itself or from the heart muscle itself is drained into the right atrium of the heart by the coronary sinus. So these are the three main vessels. Superior vena cava drains the upper extremities of the body, head, neck, thorax, upper arms. Inferior vena cava drains the lower extremities of the body, and the heart itself is drained by the coronary sinus, and the deoxygenated blood is dumped into the right atrium. All right, so we have a lot of blood in the right atrium now, right? So as more and more blood fills up the right atrium, what happens to the pressure inside the chamber? Yes, the pressure goes up. Due to this high pressure in the right atrium, the tricuspid valve is forced open. So the tricuspid opens, and blood from the right atrium comes into the right ventricle. Okay. Now more and more blood fills up the right ventricle, and as pressure builds up in the right ventricle, two things happen. Please hear me. The tricuspid valve closes back. So tricuspid valve closes, and the semilunar valve, specifically the pulmonary semilunar valve, opens. And as the semilunar valve opens, blood from the right ventricle moves into this vessel called the pulmonary trunk. And then from the pulmonary trunk, blood ultimately reaches the lungs via these two blue-colored vessels, and these are called, the blue-colored vessels are called pulmonary arteries. Pulmonary arteries. Okay, so let's review this one more time. Okay. Deoxygenated blood from the superior part of the body is drained into the right atrium via superior vena cava. Deoxygenated blood from the inferior part of the body is also drained into the right atrium via inferior vena cava. And deoxygenated blood from the heart itself is also drained into the right atrium via coronary sinus. As more and more blood enters the right atrium, pressure builds up, and due to the high pressure, the tricuspid valve opens up and blood rushes from the right atrium into the right ventricle. So more and more blood enters the right ventricle now, and as pressure builds up, two things happen. First, the tricuspid valve is shut closed, and the pulmonary semilunar valve is forced open, leading the blood into the pulmonary trunk. This vessel right here is pulmonary trunk. Pulmonary trunk. Leading blood into the pulmonary trunk, which then divides into pulmonary arteries, carrying the deoxygenated blood into the lungs. Clear? All right. Now, what happens in the lungs? Well, there is gaseous exchange, right? So all the carbon dioxide is dumped out and the blood picks up fresh oxygen. And the oxygenated blood from the lungs, listen carefully, the oxygenated blood from the lungs returns back to the left atrium via 4 pulmonary veins. So these veins, do you see these? These are pulmonary veins that carry blood from the lungs back into the left atrium. These are pulmonary veins. And I will just label the pulmonary veins here. These are pulmonary veins. All right. So now we have oxygenated blood in the left atrium. Very similar thing. As more and more blood fills up the left atrium, obviously pressure builds up. Due to the high pressure, the bicuspid valve is forced open, so bicuspid opens up, and blood from the left atrium rushes into the left ventricle. As more and more blood fills up the left ventricle, pressure builds up and two things happen again. The bicuspid is shut closed and the aortic semilunar valve, which is right here, this one opens up. And blood from the left ventricle then enters into the aorta. The purple vessel is aorta, which finally carries blood to different parts of the body. Okay? One thing I would like to add here is that remember that the four valves we talked about, the tricuspid, the bicuspid, the pulmonary semilunar, and the aortic semilunar, all four valves only allow unidirectional flow of blood, meaning blood can only flow one way, and these valves prevent backflow of blood. For example, the tricuspid will only allow blood to move from the right atrium into the right ventricle but prevent backflow. Okay, so that's true for all the four valves. All right, so let's do a quick review here. So deoxygenated blood from the superior part of the body enters the right atrium via superior vena cava. Deoxygenated blood from the inferior part of the body enters the same chamber via inferior vena cava. And deoxygenated blood from the heart itself is drained into the right atrium via coronary sinus. Good. As more and more blood fills up the right atrium, pressure builds up. That forces open the tricuspid valve and blood flows from the right atrium into the right ventricle. As pressure builds up in the right ventricle, the tricuspid valve closes and the pulmonary semilunar valve opens up, leading blood into the pulmonary trunk, which then divides into pulmonary arteries, leading the deoxygenated blood into the lungs. Gaseous exchange takes place in the lungs, so all the carbon dioxide is dumped out and the blood picks up fresh oxygen, and the oxygenated blood then returns to the left atrium of the lungs via 4 pulmonary veins. So the pink vessels are the pulmonary veins. What's wrong here? Hold on. Okay, so these are the pulmonary veins carrying oxygenated blood into the left atrium. As more and more blood fills up the left atrium, same thing, pressure builds up. Due to the high pressure, the bicuspid valve is forced open and blood rushes from the left atrium into the left ventricle. As more and more blood fills the left ventricle, the bicuspid valve is shut closed, and the aortic semilunar valve opens up, leading blood into the aorta that finally distributes the oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. That's all about the blood flow through the heart. One thing that I would like to add here is that movement of blood from the right side, so from this side to the lungs, back to the left side. So from right to lungs to left. This forms a pulmonary circuit. Pulmonary means related to the lungs, right? So from right side, blood goes to the lungs and then returns to the left side. This is a pulmonary circuit. And then from the left side of the heart, which is this side, from the left side of the heart, blood goes to different parts of the body and then it comes back to the right side. And this circuit is called the systemic circuit. Hopefully that makes sense, right? We have a pulmonary circuit and a systemic circuit. I will start with another video.